I was just catching up on a little bit of juggling practice. You see, I'm not one to ever be in the circus, but I do enjoy juggling a little bit, and I have some spare supplies laying around because I was stocking up. I've got lots of toilet paper in the house right now, as I'm sure maybe some of you do if you've stocked up on your toilet paper. And I figured what better to do with toilet paper that I have extra of than juggle a little bit. So that's what I was doing this morning. You caught me juggling. I'm going to go ahead and set this stuff down over here. And I'll have a seat so we can get to our reading today. So today I looked ahead and we actually have a really short chapter first. Chapter 23 is very short, but then our chapter 24 is going to be a little bit longer. So I'll read chapter 23 and chapter 24 today. Then I'll get to our sock segment, and then we'll close with some shout-outs. So again, welcome back to another episode of Hamilton Reads. I'm your host, Mr. Hamilton, and let's get back to the book, shall we? Chapter 23 is called Square Sweets That Look Round. Everybody stopped and crowded to the door. The top half of the door was made of glass. Grandpa Joe lifted Charlie up so that he could get a better view, and looking in, Charlie saw a long table, and over the table there were rows and rows of small, white, squared-shaped sweets. The sweets looked very much like square sugar lumps, except that each of them had a funny little pink face painted on one side. At the end of the table, a number of Oompa Loompas were busily painting more faces on more sweets. "Oh, there you are," cried Mr. Wonka. "Square sweets that look round." "They don't look round to me," said Mike Teavee. "They look square," said Veruca Salt. "They look completely square." "Oh, but they are square," said Mr. Wonka. "I never said they weren't." "You said they were round," said Veruca Salt. "I never said anything of the sort," said Mr. Wonka. "I said they looked round." "But they don't look round," said Veruca Salt. "They look square," she said again. "Well, they look round," insisted Mr. Wonka. "They most certainly do not look round," cried Veruca Salt. "Veruca, darling," said Mrs. Salt, "pay no attention to Mr. Wonka. He's lying to you." "Oh, my dear old fish," said Mr. Wonka, "go and boil your head." "How dare you speak to me like that?" shouted Mrs. Salt. "Oh, do shut up," said Mr. Wonka. "Now watch this." He took a key from his pocket and unlocked the door and flung it open, and suddenly at the sound of the door opening, all the rows of little square sweets looked quickly around to see who was coming in. The tiny faces actually turned towards the door and stared at Mr. Wonka. "Oh, there you are," he cried triumphantly. "They're looking around. There's no argument about it. They are square sweets that look round." "Oh, by golly, he's right," said Grandpa Joe. "Come on," said Mr. Wonka, starting off down the corridor again. "You're a loud drinker, man." He's such a loud drinker. Marvin, come here, dude. Here, why don't you come say hi to everybody? Come say hi. So we have a little, I'll take a pause from reading. We have a little doggy door at the back of our house that we allow Marvin to go in and out throughout the day into our backyard. So he was just out playing around. I could hear him squeaking his squeaky toy. I don't know if you could hear him. And then he came in, he was so tired that he wanted a bunch of water, and he was drinking up a storm. So I'll give you another treat here, Marv. You can say hi to everybody. I know you're the star of the show. Everybody prefers to see you anyway. All right, back to the action. "By golly, he's right," said Grandpa Joe. "Come on," said Mr. Wonka, starting off down the corridor again. "On we go. We mustn't dawdle." "Butterscotch and buttered gin," it said on the next door. "Now that sounds a bit more interesting," said Mr. Salt, Veruca's father. "Oh, glorious stuff," said Mr. Wonka. "The Oompa Loompas all adore it. It makes them tiddly. Listen, you can hear them in there now, whooping it up. Shrieks of laughter and snatches of singing could be heard through the closed door. Oh, they're drunk as lords, said Mr. Wonka. They're drinking butterscotch and soda. They like that best of all. Butter gin and tonic is also very popular. Follow me, please. We really mustn't keep stopping like this. He turned left, he turned right, then came to a long flight of stairs. Mr. Wonka slid down the banisters. The three children did the same. Mrs. Salt and Mrs. Teavee, the only women now left in the party, were getting very out of breath. Mrs. Salt was a great fat creature with short legs, and she was blowing like a rhinoceros. This way, cried Mr. Wonka, turning left at the bottom of the stairs. Well, go slower, panted Mrs. Salt. Impossible, said Mr. Wonka. We should never get there in time if I did. Get where? Said Veruca Salt. Well, never you mind, said Mr. Wonka. You just wait and see. Chapter 24 is called Veruca in the Nut Room. Mr. Wonka rushed on down the corridor. The Nut Room, it said on the next door they came to. All right, said Mr. Wonka. Stop here for a moment and catch your breath and take a peek through the glass panel of this door. But don't go in. Whatever you do, don't go into the Nut Room. If you go in, you'll disturb the squirrels. Everyone crowded around the door. Oh, look, Grandpa, look, crowded Charlie. Squirrels, shouted Veruca Salt. Oh, crikey, said Mike Teavee. It was an amazing sight. 100 squirrels were seated upon high stools around a large table. On the table there were mounds and mounds of walnuts, and the squirrels were all working away like mad, shelling the walnuts at a tremendous speed. These squirrels are especially trained for getting nuts out of walnuts, Mr. Wonka explained. Why use squirrels? Mike Teavee asked. Why not use Oompa Loompas? Oh, because, said Mr. Wonka, Oompa Loompas can't get walnuts out of walnut shells in one piece. They always break them in two. Nobody except squirrels can get walnuts whole out of a walnut shell every time. It's extremely difficult. But in my factory, I insist upon only whole walnuts. Therefore, I have to use squirrels to do the job. Aren't they wonderful the way they get those nuts out? And see how they first tap each walnut with their knuckles to be sure it's hollow? Oh, to make sure it's not a bad one? If it's bad, it makes a hollow sound, and they don't bother to open it. They just throw it down the rubbish chute. There, look! Watch that squirrel nearest to us. I think he's got a bad one. They watched the little squirrel as he tapped the walnut shell with his knuckles. He cocked his head to one side, listening intently. Then suddenly he threw the nut over his shoulder into a large hole in the floor. Hey, Mommy, shouted Veruca Salt suddenly. I've decided I want a squirrel. Give me one of those squirrels. Oh, don't be silly, sweetheart, said Mrs. Salt. These all belong to Mr. Wonka. Well, I don't care about that, shouted Veruca. I want one. All I've got at home is 2 dogs and 4 cats and 6 bunnies and 2 parakeets and 3 canaries and a green parrot and a turtle and a bowl of goldfish and a cage of white mice and a silly old hamster. I want a squirrel. All right, my pet, Mrs. Salt said soothingly. Mommy'll get you a squirrel just as soon as she possibly can. Oh, but I don't want any old squirrel, Veruca shouted. I want a trained squirrel. At this point, Mr. Salt, Veruca's father, stepped forward. Very well, Wonka, he said importantly, taking out a wallet full of money. How much do you want for one of these squirrels? Name your price. Oh, they're not for sale, Mr. Wonka answered. She can't have one. Well, who says I can't? Shouted Veruca. I'm going in to get myself one this very minute. Don't, said Mr. Wonka quickly. But he was too late. The girl had already thrown open the door and rushed in. The moment she entered the room, 100 squirrels stopped what they were doing and turned their heads and stared at her with small, black, beady eyes. Veruca Salt stopped also. You're being a little difficult, buddy. And stared back at them. Then her gaze fell upon a pretty little squirrel sitting nearest to her at the end of the table. The squirrel was holding a walnut in its paws. "All right," Veruca said, "I'll have you." She reached out her hands to grab the squirrel. But as she did so, in that first split second when her hands started to go forward, there was a sudden flash of movement in the room like a flash of brown lightning, and every single squirrel around the table took a flying leap towards her and landed on her body. 25 of them caught hold of her right arm and pinned it down. 25 more caught hold of her left arm and pinned that down. 25 caught hold of her right leg and anchored it to the ground. 24 caught hold of her left leg, and the one remaining squirrel, obviously the leader of them all, climbed up on her shoulder and started tapping the wretched girl's head with its knuckles. "Save her!" screamed Mrs. Salt. "Veruca, come back! What are they doing to her?" "Well, they're testing to see if she's a bad nut," said Mr. Wonka. "You watch." Veruca struggled furiously, but the squirrels held her tight and she couldn't move. The squirrel on her shoulder went tapping the side of her head with its knuckles. Then all at once, the squirrels pulled Veruca to the ground and started carrying her across the floor. "My goodness, she is a bad nut after all," said Mr. Wonka. "Her head must have sounded quite hollow." Veruca kicked and screamed, but it was no use. The tiny, strong paws held her tightly and she couldn't escape. "Where are they taking her?" shrieked Mrs. Salt. "She's going where all the other bad nuts go," said Mr. Willy Wonka. "Down the rubbish chute." "By golly, she is going down the chute," said Mr. Salt, staring through the glass door at his daughter. "Well, then save her," cried Mrs. Salt. "Too late," said Mr. Wonka. "She's gone." And indeed she had. "But where?" shrieked Mrs. Salt, flapping her arms. "What's happened to the bad nuts? Where does the chute go to?" "That particular chute," Mr. Wonka told her, "runs directly into the great big main rubbish pipe, which carries away all the rubbish from every part of the factory. All the floor sweepings and potato peelings and rotten cabbages and fish heads and stuff like that." "Who eats fish and cabbage and potatoes in this factory, I'd like to know," said Mike Teavee. "Well, I do, of course," said Mr. Wonka. "You don't think I live on cacao beans, do you?" But, shrieked Mrs. Salt, "where does the great big pipe go to in the end?" "Why, to the furnace, of course," Mr. Wonka said calmly. "To the incinerator." "Listen here, Buckwheat, I'm reading, and I don't care what you say." "Settle down, I love you. I love you, and I will give you all the attention in the world when I'm done reading. But the children want their books. The children deserve their books." Mrs. Salt opened her huge red mouth and started to scream. "Oh, don't worry," said Mr. Wonka. "There's always a chance that they've decided not to light it today." "Well, a chance?" yelled Mrs. Salt. "My darling Veruca, she'll be sizzled like a sausage." "Quite right, my dear," said Mr. Salt. "Now see here, Wonka," he added, "I think they've gone just a shade too far this time, I do indeed. My daughter may be a bit of a frump, I don't mind admitting it, but that doesn't mean you can roast her to a crisp. I'll have you know I'm extremely cross about this, I really am." "Oh, don't be cross, my dear sir," said Mr. Wonka. "I expect she'll return up again sooner or later. She may not even have gone down at all. She may be stuck in the chute just below the entrance hole, and if that's the case, all you'll have to do is go in and pull her up again." Hearing this, both Mr. and Mrs. Salt dashed into the nut room and ran over to the hole in the floor and peered in. "Veruca!" shouted Mrs. Salt. "Are you down there, Veruca?" There was no answer. Mrs. Salt bent further forward to get a closer look. She was now kneeling right on the edge of the hole with her head down and her enormous behind sticking up in the air like a giant mushroom. It was a dangerous position to be in. She needed only one tiny little push, one gentle nudge in the right place. And that is exactly what the squirrels gave her. Over she toppled into the hole head first, screeching like a parrot. "Oh, good gracious me," said Mr. Salt, as he watched his fat wife go tumbling down the hole. "What a whole lot of rubbish there's going to be today." He saw her disappearing into the darkness. "What's it like down there, Angina?" he called out. He leaned further forward. The squirrels rushed up behind him. "Help!" he shouted. But he was already toppling forward, and down the chute he went, just as his wife had done before him, and his daughter. "Oh dear," cried Charlie, who was watching with the others through the door. "What on earth's going to happen to them now?" "I expect someone will catch them at the bottom of the chute," said Mr. Wonka. "But what about the great fiery incinerator?" asked Charlie. "Oh, they only light it every other day," said Mr. Wonka. "Perhaps this is one of the days when they let it go out. You never know, they might be lucky." "Shh," said Grandpa Joe. "Listen, here comes another song." From far away down the corridor came the beating of drums. Then the singing began. "Veruca Salt," sang the Oompa Loompas. "Veruca Salt, the little brute, has just gone down the rubbish chute. And as we very rightly thought, that in a case like this we ought to see the thing completely through, we've polished off her parents too. Down goes Veruca, down the drain, and here perhaps we should explain that she will meet, as she descends, a rather different set of friends to those that she has left behind. These won't be nearly so refined. A fish head, for example, cut this morning from a halibut. Hello, good morning, how do you do? How nice to meet you, how are you? And then a little farther down, a mass of others gather round. A bacon rind, some rancid lard, a loaf of bread gone stale and hard, a steak that nobody could chew, an oyster from an oyster stew, some liverwurst so old and gray, one smelled it from a mile away, a rotten nut, a reeky pear, a thing the cat left in the stair, and lots of other things as well, each with a rather horrid smell. These are Veruca's newfound friends that she will meet as she descends, and this is the price she has to pay for going so very far astray. But now, my dears, we think you might be wondering, is it really right that every single bit of blame and all the scolding and the shame should fall upon Veruca Salt? For those she's spoiled, and dreadfully so. A girl can't spoil herself, you know. Who spoiled her then? Ah, who indeed? Who pandered to her every need? Who turned her into such a brat? Who are the culprits? Who did that? Alas, you needn't look so far to find out who those sinners are. They are, and this is very sad, her loving parents, Mom and Dad. And this is why we're glad they fell into the rubbish chute as well. And that's the end of the chapter, and that's where we're going to stop today. Come down here. Come on. Come down. All right. Jeez, Marvin was giving me a tough time today, weren't you? You just wanted attention. I know you did. I know you just wanted attention. But you can't climb on the dining room table. Now I gotta wash it. And wipe it down. You goof. Alright, hop down. Come here. Alright. So anyway, that was chapter 23 and chapter 24. Chapters 23 and 24. Now, as I promised, I'm going to do my sock segment. After my sock segment, I've got a couple shout-outs, and then we'll end the episode today, Tuesday, April 21st. So my socks today are special socks. They're very unique socks, and I got to be honest, I'm kind of running out of unique, different socks. I have about 15 to 20-ish, and depending on when they're in the laundry, I'm running out. I think today's my 16th episode, So I'm getting close to the end of my socks. So if I start repeating, well, maybe I need to put on my Christmas list more silly socks. Excuse me. Anyway, I think all the hair that's on the table has got me coughing a little bit. Sometimes I'm a little allergic to dogs. Don't tell Marvin though. Okay. So anyway, my sock segment. Let me stand up for you today. My socks. I have. First of all, have you ever seen the books Where's Waldo? Well, let's play the game. Where's Waldo? You ready? Where's Waldo? Right there he is. There's Waldo right there. Hi, Waldo. We'll put Waldo away. So Waldo can take a little nap. And I'll have a seat again. Marvin, you want to say goodbye? Alright, so Marvin, do you have any shout-outs? I think if Marvin could do shout-outs, Marvin would probably shout out going on long walks and long hikes. He would say shout out to all the trails. Today we went on a little fishing adventure, me and my girlfriend Summer, and we took Marvin and we were walking down the creek, and usually when we're fishing we don't leave Marvin on a leash because we're really close to him and he stays near us. He's good about that. And today he started chasing after a couple geese that were swimming in the creek, and he chased them down the creek, and it was really, really funny. So anyway, I'm sure Marvin would shout out long walks and tennis balls, and Marvin would probably also shout out Wishbone for all their delicious dog treats. So for my shout outs today, I would number one, I would like to shout out to the first guy to ever come up with putting a graphic on a sock. I thought that's really cool. I'm sure back in the day they just had plain white or plain black or brown socks or whatever. So shout out to the first person, man or woman, whoever put a graphic on a sock. It's pretty cool. Somebody's getting a little creative. I would also like to shout out two of my favorite restaurants today, one of which I had tonight and one of which I had last night. Tonight I got takeout from a place called Marcello's, and I got their chicken cheesesteak. I love their chicken cheesesteak. It's really, really good. I always get extra cheese and fried onions. And then also shout out to Rob Burritos. I had Rob Burritos last night, and Rob Burritos #1 has great burritos, but I like to get their Burrito Dilla, it's called, Burrito Dilla, and I got a little jar of their Midnight Mango Sauce, which is really good as well. I think Marvin knows that if he gets up on the table, he'll get lots of attention. I think he knows he's being disobedient right now. But anyway, my last shout out goes to the inventor of one of my favorite games of all time, Alfred Mosher Butts. Alfred Mosher Butts is the inventor of Scrabble, which is actually one of my favorite board games. And since we're about to close the episode, I'll show you something really special for me. Really special. So, hello. Here's a little board we have in my house. And right now it says Braden is annoying. But then at the bottom, we have a little score. And B is my first initial, Braden. And then S is my girlfriend's first initial, Summer. So we've been keeping track of how many Scrabble games she's won in the last week. And so far it's 6-0 me. So I'm doing very well. So shout out to Alfred Mosher Butts, the inventor of Scrabble, a game that I love very, very much. So thanks for stopping by for another episode today on Tuesday, April 21st. And stay tuned for another episode tomorrow, Wednesday, April 22nd.